Vice President Joe Biden is leading in a couple of new polls, but there is a major focus on one candidate who isn't even polling above 1%.
Team Rising is here. Antoine C. Wright, he's a Democratic strategist, previously served as senior advisor to Hillary Clinton in South Carolina. And Jack Kingston served as Georgia congressman for 22 years, served as senior advisor to President Trump's 2016 campaign. Welcome to you both.
Gentlemen.
Well, thank you.
Friends of the show. So we've got very interesting new polls here. We'll start with Emerson. Shows basically the former vice president up at the field, 27%. Interestingly enough, Bernie Sanders at 25% and Elizabeth Warren at 21%.
Pretty close there, all at the top.
Yeah, it's quite close there, but it actually is also validated. We have a new CNN poll that also shows Joe Biden at 34% to top this race. We should note that only about 30% of those respondents were actually registered Democrats. But Antoine, Biden, despite all of the narratives, he took a hit in the morning consult favorabilities. He's still sitting atop the race, at least in these two polls.
It just puts a period at the end of the sentence that I often repeat to people. There's a different conversation in the bubble among the political elites or the political analysts versus people who actually own the ground and people who would likely cast their vote. And I think we're starting to see that play out. But you also can't discount the rise and the continued rise of Warren and the consistency we've seen from Bernie Sanders. So I think the top three have been consistent in many of the polls that have come out about the Democratic Party. But it's also a lesson that the more the attacks come on Biden, and while some think it weakens him, it just shows that he is the right person in the minds of primary voters to take on Donald Trump.
Yeah, some people, when they see an attack, it actually strengthens their support. Look, the CNN poll, interestingly, this has the largest margin for Biden that we've seen since April. Huge. Now, Sagar laid out a few of the caveats. It's got a huge margin of error, almost 6%. Only 30% of the respondents were Democrats, so it is a little bit of an outlier. But still, even if you look at the average of all polls, in spite of the media narrative, it doesn't look like Biden has declined, even after a very lackluster debate performance and taking on water due to this impeachment inquiry focusing on the business dealings of his family.
Well, but two things. Remember that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are picking apples out of the exact same tree. They have...
Not really, though.
Well,
actually, their coalition is quite different. Actually, there's more overlap between Biden's coalition and Bernie's than between Warren and Sanders.
Well, I think demographically they have a lot in common, but they have a lot of diversity. But I think in terms of being known as the socialist-type candidates, that's Warren and Bernie more than anybody else. But, Warren also kind of had a bad week because finally the Democrats are saying to her, what is your cost of Medicare for all? Some of the estimates are as high as $32 trillion or something like that. And she's had really poor answers to that. So I think she kind of had a tough week herself.
Yeah, I covered that a bit earlier in the show.
And yet on the other hand, media has been very excited about Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. First of all, Amy doesn't even make it onto our graphics here because in the Emerson poll, at least she's at 1%. Right, and how many articles have you read about she's getting a second look, she's searching at the right times, Politico headlines, she's got wind in her sails. And there's also no sign of a real bump for Pete outside of a few polls in Iowa. So there's that thing going on as well. I think we have to be honest.
Like the media, I think, if you talk to most of them off the record, they would tell you the kind of narrative about this race has been the top three candidates, Biden, Warren, and Sanders. So they're looking for light at the end of a different tunnel. So I think it's part of the But I want to be consistent because I've said this on the show before, so I want to be consistent. Polls are a snapshot of the time. I will also say that the polls that really matter are state polls. The national polls are good to flirt with, but they're not the ones we should date and marry when it comes to this race.
Which poll should we date and marry, Antoine?
The most important poll is South Carolina, which is where I'm going.
I knew you were going there.
But unless there is some breakdown in the political nerve center of this party, African-American voters, I do not see the dynamics of Biden continuing to be in the front runner change. I've always told you, when you get to South Carolina, that's when the race begins because it's a true reflection of the Democratic electorate when you think about the African-American vote and the states that follow are very similar.
Well, and that is part of the thing that's been mystifying to me about this idea that certainly Pete's campaign is floating, but a lot of reporters have picked up on that he's going to be the one to take Biden's support. he still polls at basically 0% with African Americans, and that is the strongest base of Joe Biden. So there's simply no evidence.
There's no trust there.
There's no evidence that black voters are going to move over to Pete.
Right.
Zero.
I personally don't see it. Look, the focus groups were leaked to the state newspaper in South Carolina yesterday, and it essentially confirms what I've been saying for a while. While I think Pete is exciting for some, it's still a challenge. His candidacy is still a challenge for older African American voters in the South, and I don't think they needed focus groups to confirm that, but I think it's still an opportunity for him to make his case and change hearts and minds.
So Jack, we also have the media is trying very hard, from Bill Maher, and even Chris Hayes was talking very complimentary about Amy Klobuchar. Why is it that people look at Amy Klobuchar? Is it just like a desperation to cast a centrist into the race? I don't get it.
I think there is this yearning among many people for a more centrist candidate. Keep in mind, by the way, I want to point out, we don't talk about the fact that Joe Biden essentially has been running for president for over 20 years. Right. So, and that is important. It is not his first rodeo. In the classic sense, he's kind of knows how to talk and about things in a real lofty way, the way that Warren and Sanders does. Klobuchar's problem, in my opinion, as a former incumbent, is she knows the real world. She knows what's possible. And a lot of her thinking is, I get things done, but in order to get things done, I have to have Mike Lee and Ted Cruz kind of working with me, and I have to have Chuck Schumer on board, and I got to get Mitch McConnell on board. So her vision is more on hands, practical, like a soldier from the combat zone. Hey, this is what's really going on out there. And in primaries, People don't want to hear it. But Democrat or Republican, they want to hear that. We're going to impeach him, and we're going to have health care for all.
Don't see working with Mitch McConnell as practical.
Well, first of all, he's not working with Democrats nowadays. Let's be clear about that. But I think Klobuchar was right in her strategy to attempt to be an alternative to Biden from the pragmatic centrist approach, and that's what you've seen from her campaign. Although it's not sexy and it doesn't make the headlines, to a point, it's still keeping her relevant because depending on the news cycle, some see Biden as on political life support, others see him as being the strongest horse in the race in November. So I think she's taking the right approach.
It's a good media play, obviously. She's gotten glowing coverage this week. Yet to be proven that it's a good voter play. Well, that hasn't shown up.
But the other thing is, she should have a good advantage in Iowa. That's a neighbor state. It's kind of a home court compared to somebody like Warren or Sanders in particular. So I think the media wants to at least be able to say she could be a player, and if she's in the top 5, we can say, I told you so.
In my view with Klobuchar, it's that, she might have a 5% showing in Iowa or something like that, but nobody is actually yearning for centrism, I think. And what it really is that people who are the centrists, they trust Biden because of his relationship with Barack Obama. And all these other ideologically, that's not what other people see.
Let me push back for a second on that. I think, no doubt in my mind, being the first African-American president as VP carries some weight. But I think when you talk to older black voters in the South, particularly in South Carolina, Joe Biden is known as Mr. Reliable, Uncle Joe, Mr. Consistent. He's been there for them on the issues, and he's been there in a way that not other politicians have been, particularly in this race. And before Barack Obama, there was Joe Biden coming to campaign places where other national Democratic figures could not go.
Like
if you look
Strom
at
Thurmond's funeral.
If you look at what happened,
and he got away with it.
Jack,
I mean, I admire him for doing that.
Jack, but
I just want to say something.
But if you look at what happened in 2018, there were very few national Democrats could go and campaign for congressional candidates and down ballot races in the places where Donald Trump won. One of the only people who could do that was Vice President Biden.
Interesting.
Yeah, we should not forget his political prowess. I will say that.
And he looks like your banker. He looks like a responsible adult. Bernie Sanders looks like your physics teacher. Just kind of, just got out of line. I'm splitting.
You're getting about to get lit up.
I'm telling you, there is a comfort.
And what is Donald Trump? What does Donald Trump look like?
He
didn't look like the guy that we're going to elect president either.
We got to take a quick break. You guys sit tight. We'll be right back after this.